I want to start by saying to all of you, congratulations, because you have made it to the last unit of class. The first unit of rhetorical criticism was about some basic issues in the study of rhetoric and focusing on a very traditional speech-oriented model of criticism. We then moved into talking about narrative and fantasy theme, which was a fairly traditional rhetorical criticism. Another sort of traditional method of criticism are the Burkean methods, if you will, or Burkean theory. And so we've talked about Kenneth Burke. And now we moved on to ideological criticism. So here we are. And we're talking about ideological criticism. There are three things we're really going to be addressing, and that's issues of culture, identity, and power. And I guess I'll tell you that probably, well, actually, even more so than the use of Burke in my work, this is probably the general body of research and perspectives and thinking that I've drawn from most in my own research. But enough of that. Let's dive into ideological criticism. So the chapter calls itself NeoMarxist Criticism, right? Why then am I calling this ideological? It's a bit of a history lesson, sort of the history of thought and ideas thing, and so I'm not going to get really deep into it. But one of the things that was really important about the works of Karl Marx is that he talked about the way that there were systems set up in economies, but by the government, within culture, that maintained various persons in different positions, right? So he's very much, Marx that is very much focused on, in part, right, or I shouldn't say part, largely on issues of the economy and capital, and the idea that some people are making money in the sense of they are, that they are accumulating wealth, and others are doing the work and the making that creates the capital that is then enjoyed by those first people, right? So that ideological criticism is very much aimed at understanding who in a culture, a society, a country, a place, a government, a system, etc., is benefiting, and often who are they, at whose expense are they benefiting? That's what Marx is doing, right? That's what Marx is doing. So the idea that it's neo-Marxist, it's the sort of new Marxist thing, right? We had neo before because we had neo-Aristotelianism, right? But so, because it was Aristotle, but now new, right? And that's what this is. This is, Marx, but now new. And so some of the early work with Marx, in fact, was the work of feminists, who they began doing much of the same critique and analysis that Marx was doing, not merely of economy in terms of money that's earned, but the way that some people are kept out of positions of power and other people maintain their positions of power in a society, and how if we shifted from talking about largely experiences of men, but not entirely, but largely experiences of men, and sort of the production of capital and who reaps the rewards of capital and all that sort of stuff. If we shifted it to, well, how is it that a culture and a society runs on, say, the work and the labor of women that is largely enjoyed by men, right? You see some really neat, and by neat, I don't mean like neato, I mean, but very clear, right, easy to draw the line between connections then. And so that's why neo-Marxist criticism is really the same as what others call ideological criticism. It's because Marx is the basis of that. Marx is the basis of talking about structural inequalities and how those are recreated. And so it's ideological criticism, right? That's ideological. And if you think about in the very first chapter, we were talking about ideology. Also, was thinking that really, that's what I was going for. And if you look back in chapter 1, you'll see that Sella defines it as, allow me to read, right? Ideology as cultural groups' perceptions about the way things are and assumptions about the way they ought to be. So that's why when we're doing neo-Marxist criticism, we're really talking about issues of ideology. And so the next chapter we're going to be looking at is feminist criticism. All of this, and we're talking about here, you'll see very quickly, the principles that we have of neo-Marxist criticism are really the principles we have of ideological criticism that applies to all manner of ideology, power, and identity, which, as I said, is very much the focus, well, of ideological criticism, of neo-Marxism, and really this unit, this fourth unit in class. So key terms that we need to be familiar with as we're using ideological criticism. We're getting into ideological criticism. The first of those is ideology. And I just gave that definition a moment ago. As I said, we've been talking about this since, I think when I looked up here, it was saying, page 6 of the textbook. We've been talking about ideology. But yeah, it's people's belief about how things are and how they should be. And so you can very quickly see, or very easily see, how this will relate to, yes, issues of economy and money and who has money and wealth, and also about what are the roles that we should expect of women and men, and the importance of maintaining, or the lack of importance of maintaining, those categories of male and female, masculine, feminine, right? About issues of sexuality, about issues of race and ethnicity, right? And how various people of different groups and different identities, how they're seen. So ideology, right? So ideology is how it is an individual group. And my focus here is largely on sort of dominant US culture, how an individual group believe things are and things should be. Then we get critical rhetoric. So critical rhetoric is the study of rhetoric. Shocking, I know, right? But it's the study of rhetoric interested in understanding essentially how are ideologies perpetuated, defined, maintained, right? That's what critical rhetoric is doing. It's trying to understand what are the ideologies that are at work behind certain messages, right? Because of the study of rhetoric, behind public messages. So within an artifact or a text, what sort of ideology is being represented here? Very often, what assumptions about culture, what ideology is not so plain. I mean, sometimes you'll see definitions of critical rhetoric and it's talking about revealing or unmasking or exposing hegemonic or ideological practices. We'll talk about hegemony in a moment here. But critical rhetoric then is a study of rhetoric very much interested in understanding, revealing the ideology that is within an artifact, perpetuated by an artifact, or that an artifact supports, right? How a certain artifact might support a certain ideology. And so when we have a TV show that likes to, or a movie for that matter, right? And the camera has a tendency to focus on women's body parts. This may be a movie that's very much about women doing sort of really great, impressive things, but when you keep having these camera shots of women's body parts, especially young, slender, idealized sort of beauty images of women, we say, wait a minute, I think that this is not strictly for an audience of people who want to really see women challenge norms, but for people who feel ultimately pretty comfortable with the objectification of women, right? So critical rhetoric does those sorts of things. So I'm pretty sure we talked about hegemony here before, right? But hegemony has to do with the ways in which power structures, or we could say ideologies, right, perpetually maintain and recreate themselves. I always say in the face of challenge, right? So even as you get certain sorts of challenges, we still maintain certain norms to it. And so I find often that when you get a movie that is about, if we're talking about gender here for a moment, a movie that really seeks to go and to challenge notions of women. And so, like the first Wonder Woman movie, as I say, the one from just a few years ago, I love that movie, right? And it was great, but it did also go about sort of maintaining certain notions about idealized femininity, even though she was very tough and right, so forth, right there. Yeah, certain sort of about femininity, idealized femininity are there. Not so bad as it was in the subsequent movie where the women's outfits got even more sort of, sexy, hotsy-totsy sorts of things. That's that hegemony. So we go to challenge something, and then we find that the system or the ideology is perpetuating itself. We're also very much interested in, if we do critical rhetoric here, in othering, and the ways in which it's very clear within an ideology how some people are in the in group and some people are the out group, and they're made, as we say, the other. Right? So the ones that we care about, the ones who are central, the ones who are key. When I say key, I just mean, they're the main characters, the ones we care about, the ones who, as an audience, we're always supposed to care about and identify with. And then there's the others, right? And they just don't matter as much to us. And that's not really in art, in rhetoric. But whenever we talk about othering is a process by which we mark other people as being, I say other people, I guess you could say other, or usually people of certain identities or other cultures, say other cultures, right? Non-dominant cultures, non-dominant identities, non-dominant cultures, as being odd, weird, strange. It's that other one. It's not the normal one. It's the other one. And so that's othering. And whatever makes somebody the other, we are ultimately valuing them less. We care less about them, and we're more likely to use them and even to hurt them, right? When somebody is being othered, that's what's happening. Our next term is a fun one to say, interpolation, right? And if you look at interpolation, you'll see there's this root here, right? Interp. And so you see it and you think interpretation. Well, interpolation and interpretation are loosely related, because what happens when you are interpolated, and it can be used as a verb, but it is you are interpolated, and that is that you are asked to, or you find yourself identifying, like a Burkean term almost, right? But identifying with the artifact, with the text. So you are interpolated when you are asked to go along and see this with them and feel okay with the things that they're doing and feel that they are righteous in what they're doing. You may have before watched a show like or a movie or whatever, most recently something like Breaking Bad, which by the way I really can't say I've seen. So I if you haven't, I haven't either, right? But the story follows a not very nice, or some people say starts out sort of nice, right? Person doing some not very nice things. Like, I love the show Mad Men. Some of you may have seen it, may have not. But, Don Draper, the main character there, played by John Hamm, a lot of times is doing some really bad things, but often, and as you're watching this, you feel you're being drawn and asked to really feel along with this guy and be with him and be on his side, as he's sort of awful to his wife and, well, other women and other people, right? But it's that interpolation, right? The definition for the book, when a text occurs, when a text leads one to identify with certain roles, right? And so again, it's just asking us to share with them in a certain vision of the world. And yeah, I mean, if you've ever heard a joke being told, or you've seen something on television or on film, and you're supposed to laugh along with something, and you think, well, I know what you're getting at. It's not that I don't get the joke. It's just that I find it really offensive, right? If anything, that's a moment in which you are resisting interpolation, right? You're resisting the encouragement that you will go along. I mean, yes, that you, right, it's a matter of whether or not you are sharing with the rhetor in their interpretation or intended interpretation of the artifact. And this has to do a lot with subject position. And so those subject positions, or when we're talking about subject positions, it's about, well, honestly, how we're how we're being interpolated. How are we being situated and asked to think and to feel? And so if we go over, right, we look right back on the other part of the screen there, right, we look over at ideology, right, it's that sort of thing. So what subject position am I asked to be taking? What sort of ideology am I going to have to adopt here to understand this interpretation, to be able to identify with it? And then we get to reading positions. And reading positions have to do with, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, how it is that we actually interpret the artifact or the text. Whether when we see or we hear or we read that artifact, if we're right there with them, or if we're reading it and we're really troubled by it and so we don't feel comfortable with it and so we sort of reject what they're saying. We're going to talk about reading positions in a little bit, but that's all about when you come in contact with this artifact and it interpolates you. It asks you to take a certain subject position to share with them in their vision, right? To understand their vision and right to interpolate by occupying a certain subject position, right? Taking on certain values, right? That then your response to this has to do with your reading position, whether you reject what they're doing or whether you accept what they're doing. And we're going to talk about reading positions, so that's okay. Just hold on tight. And intertextuality, in some ways, is all about some of the media that we have today. So intertextuality, you have in there this word text, right? Right there at the center, literally at the center of it is text. And we also get this word, right? It's intertextuality. So we have the artifact, but this artifact draws on in a certain way other artifacts, perhaps. And so those artifacts it draws on, it may be that it's a piece of fiction you're watching, and it makes some sort of allusion to actual lived current events. It may do something that makes some joke or a hint or a nod or a wink or a reference to some other text or artifact. Just as a for instance, I was in the room the other day when my kids were watching an episode of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. I think it's the newest sort of line of Scooby-Doo TV shows. And it's sort of funny, in part because of the intertextuality. But there's this moment where, spoiler alert? I don't know. So there's the gang, if you're familiar with Scooby-Doo, there's the 4 kids and the dog, right, who's Scooby-Doo, right? And they travel around in their van. It's the Mystery Machine, and it's a sort of Fred's van, and he loves the Mystery Machine. And Fred ends up blowing up the Mystery Machine, sort of for the betterment of all. And the thing is, they're on fire, it's burning, and he's crying and saying, "What have I done? What have I done?" And then Daphne says, "Fred, you've done what you've always done. You've turned," I forget the line, but basically losing into a fighting chance to win, or forget whatever it said. But the way it's shot with the people these characters standing and looking at this fire, some of you may get that, some of you may not. That is a total lift from Star Trek 3. Right, which was an okay Star Trek movie, right? But it's from, this is an 80s movie, but Star Trek 3, where, the big ship, the Star Trek ship, right, with the Enterprise, is blown up, and as they're watching the thing smolder across the sky, our great hero in this series of, TV shows and movie, or that TV show and then the movies, Captain Kirk says, "What have I done?" And then his friend there, Leonard Nimoy, actually, or not Leonard Nimoy, Bones, played by DeForest Kelley, says, "You've done what you've always done. You've turned," I don't know what the line is, right, dying or losing or whatever, into a fighting chance, or whatever the line is, right? The point is that intertextuality. You're watching this thing, and there's a joke there, and the joke really works because if you get this other thing. Sort of fantasy themes, symbolic cues, sort of, right? But the intertextuality is the way that all sorts of things are woven in together. Right, they're woven together, and so this artifact and understanding it and even endorsing it can never be fully separated from all these other artifacts. Like I said, not merely understanding, but also sort of endorsing. So it's sort of like a symbolic cue in its own way. The idea that that artifact, this text, is emerging in a sort of clever, interesting weaving of many artifacts, including even not so much artifacts, but actual lived experiences and current events.